Welcome to the fourth and final lesson in this course where we have a finished texture painted. And I'll just orbit around here so we can take a look from every angle. Notice how the bark follows a flow that implies a growth pattern in this tree. And also how seamless the texture is all the way throughout. So yeah, this is great. Now we need to save the image because keep in mind that as you paint in Blender, it's not saving that file to any specific location. It's just being stored in memory. So it's crucial to actually save the image out. Let's switch to the UV image editor. I can't tell you how many times I've painted a texture, saved the blend file, and then exited Blender without saving the actual image texture. And then when I open the file again, the texture's gone. So in order to avoid that big headache, be sure to save the image. I will go to the image menu and save as image, and I will save this as tree color. And the format, let's see, I'm good with a PNG and compression up to 100%, color depth 8, and just RGB. I don't need an alpha channel. Save that out. And the next thing I want to do is derive a displacement map out of this image texture that we just painted. And this will be a fairly simple modification to the image, so I will do it in the compositor. Click this editor type button and I'll hit the N key to jump to our node editor. And we are on our compositing nodes. I will check use nodes and immediately delete the renders layer node. And in its place, we'll add an image. Let's see, input image. And let's go open that image, the one we just saved out, tree color. Plug that up to the composite node and also add an output viewer node. And once we have the viewer, we can turn on backdrop and see it appear in the background there. With Alt middle mouse, we can move our image around to look at this. And as far as the modification to get the displacement texture, I'm going to first convert it to a black and white image with RGB to BW, since displacement only worries about the high and low values. Then add a converter color ramp node, plug that in after the RGB to BW. And let's zoom in a little bit closer. The goal here is to isolate these deep cracks and crevices in the bark to be as close to black as possible, and then everything else to be in the higher registry. So we get a clear distinction between the bark that's raised and the cracks and crevices in between the bark that's indented. So with my black flag, well, first I'll add another point in the middle and change our interpolation style to B-spline. And let's drag the middle flag down, as well as our white flag down pretty far. Let's take our middle one down even further. So yeah, we're starting to isolate those dark cracks. And now let's bring the black flag up. I think that looks pretty good. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the displacement. So we'll make sure to plug that into the compositor output and go to our render settings. We'll change the resolution to our texture map size, which is 4096 by 4096. Change the percentage to 100%. And then below in the post-processing drop-down, make sure compositor is checked. And now when I click render image, we should get our displacement map. You know, looking at this again, I think I want to make the distinction a little bit more clear. So let's go back to the node editor. And I'm going to hit Shift A, color mix node. Let's throw that after the color ramp. And for both color swatches in my mix node, I'm going to drag the output from the color ramp. And this is because I want to add the image to itself. So let's change the blend type to add. And there we go. Now we can see that the cracks are that much more distinguished from the raised bark. Though I might be able to decrease the effect a little bit. Let's change the factor to 0.5. Yeah, that brings back a little bit more detail around the tree hole. Cool, so let's render that now, making sure that it's plugged up into the compositor output. Yeah, I think that's going to work much better. Cool. All right, so in the image menu, let's choose Save as Image, and we'll call this Tree Displacement, DISP. And we can use black and white instead of RGB, and the color depth at 8 is fine, compression at 100%, save that out. And now we're ready to use this with the Displace modifier. So I'll go back to the 3D view, jump into Object Mode, and go to the modifiers for our tree, which I should probably rename to make sense. Tree and ground plane. And in the modifiers, let's add, a displace modifier. And that'll blow up like popcorn because it's trying to source a texture that isn't there. So we need to create a new one. Now let's jump over to the texture settings with this little button. And we can rename the texture to be Tree Displace to match our image. And the type needs to be an image or movie. And let's open that file that we just saved. And go back to the modifier tab. And let's see, texture coordinates is by default set to local. Let's use UV instead. And that still doesn't look right. And that's because the strength is way too strong. So let's change it from 1 to 0.1. And that gets us a little bit closer. But because I have my preview set to a value of 2, the displacement effect is really bumpy and muddy and not really adding to the tree detail that we're going for. So let's try bumping it up to 4. And this will take a few seconds because it's a lot of geometry to deal with. And once that's activated, the viewport gets really choppy, and still it's kind of hard to tell what's going on with the displacement. Now we have a lot more detail, a lot higher frequency, but still it just looks kind of random and doesn't really remind us of the texture that we just painted. So before I fix that, let's go back down to a preview level of 2, and let's set up a quick render scene with a camera, lights, and a world environment map, so that as I continue with the displacement and also as I build the shader, I can do a render and show you before and after to give you a more clear idea of what I'm changing. So let's add a camera with Shift A, choose camera, hit 0 to enter that camera's view. And for some reason it's zoomed in really far by default for me. So with Control middle mouse, I'll zoom out till I see the camera frame. And let's see, in our render settings, let's use 1920 by 1080. And then hit N to bring up our view properties. Turn on lock camera to view. And now Control middle mouse out till we see our tree, and then I'll navigate around, readjust the frame until it fits our entire tree. I think that's good right there. Lock camera to view, and next we'll add an empty with plane axes. Let's change the size to 4. Hit GX to move it off to the side, and I want to center it with my camera view. Just ballpark it, about like that. We'll name this cam_lights. And then select the camera, shift select our empty that we just created, Control P in the viewport, Control P, object, and then let's grab a sun lamp, Shift A, lamp, sun, and position this somewhere up in the sky, pointed down at our tree, something about like that. And now we're ready to test the lighting setup. Hit 0 to go into the camera, change from Blender Render to Cycles Render, and for the viewport shading, let's turn on Rendered. And this is what we've got so far. So for the world, I want to add a simple outdoors texture. So I'll click New, and then in the color swatch, let's change it to Environment Texture. Click Open, let's grab an image, and I'll use Environment 02, which is just a very simple outdoors scene. And this should be a good environment for us to build a proper cycles material for our tree. But perhaps I can turn the sun power a little bit up. But since I created the lamp in the Blender internal engine, I need to click Use Nodes and change the strength from 1 to, let's go to maybe not 5, how about 2? Yeah, I think that'll work fine. And hit 0 to go back into the camera. What was I doing? Oh yeah, testing the displacement. right now I should be able to do a render and see what this looks like rendered with our multi-res at a level of 4. So let's change a few render settings. Sampling for the render we'll do 200, also for the preview 200. Light paths max 2, minimum of 1, and turn on no caustics. And then under performance we'll do tiles 32 by 32 pixels wide. And now we should have an optimized render. So render image. And it rendered the compositing nodes result. So I need to go to the post-processing tab. Where is that? All the way at the bottom. Turn off compositor and sequencer and render that again. All right, it's not looking too bad. Let's see, we can see that the resolution, especially around the face, is a little bit too low. It's a pretty chunky displacement that's not very convincing. It definitely doesn't look like bark. However, once we get into the branches, because there's a lot more geometry in the branches, it does look a lot more like our texture. However, by default, the displacement modifier displaces the geometry the same value across the entire mesh. Where this works pretty well in the trunk, actually I might want to take it down to a value of 0.05 instead of a value of 0.1, just because I still think it's too much in the trunk, but it's certainly way too much in the roots and also the branches. And in the same way that when I was painting the texture on these areas, I kept scaling the stencil down and down and down all the way to the tip, because relatively the scale makes sense. As the branch gets smaller, the bark gets smaller as well. And the same principle needs to be applied here, where on the branches the displacement is not so strong. And we have the ability to fine-tune this with a vertex group. So before I jump out of here, let's change to slot 2, hit escape to go back to our viewport, Z to get out of the preview rendering, and almost forgot the screencast keys. Let's turn those on. Okay, so for a vertex group, I'm going to tab into edit mode with everything selected, head over to the object data panel, and under vertex groups, hit the plus button, and rename this to something appropriate like displacement. And I will change the weight all the way up to 1 and click assign. Now tab out of edit mode and control tab once in object mode to go to weight paint mode. And this is where we will paint the weights, the vertex weights in the displacement group. And red means that they're all at a value of 1. And that value of 1 being everywhere on the mesh means that the strength is going to be 0.05 everywhere on the mesh. So we want to decrease the vertex weight value. And we can do that with our brushes. Like I can switch to the subtract brush and slowly start to subtract our color. And as we approach a color of blue, that means our value is getting closer and closer to 0. I think blue does mean 0. Green is somewhere in between. But this is fairly cumbersome, and we can't paint all the way through to the other side. So we'd have to paint all these limbs one by one, looking at all different angles. So that's not efficient. Instead, I'm going to use the gradient tool. So if I click that, weight gradient, and we should get a little tool. Oh yeah, when you click weight gradient, it's kind of like circle select. We can't orbit around the view anymore. But let's escape out of there just to show you what weight gradient does. I'll click it again. We get the crosshairs and we draw a line, sort of like Photoshop. So from the top of the line all the way down to the bottom is a big gradient. You can see that it changes color slightly to an orange up here, but it's not extremely noticeable. So to repeat that gradient, we can hit Shift R several times and we'll see that gradient become more intense and more obvious. So this is great, but I need to be able to isolate each branch and then use the weight gradient tool on each branch. So in order to do that, let's undo those gradients that I made. In order to make specific selections to use that tool, we can come down here in the header and turn on vertex selection masking. And if we hit C in the viewport, we get circle select that allows us to select vertices, but everything is selected now. So if I hit middle mouse, you can see that I'm deselecting vertices. However, likewise with the painting, I would have to go through each branch and select verts on both sides. So that is just annoying. Instead, I'll simply tab into edit mode and make my selection in wireframe. So circle select, and I will choose this entire branch. Actually, instead of the smallest branch, I first want to paint a gradient for all of these branches. There we go. Now I can tab back into weight paint mode, and those verts remain selected. Let's choose weight gradient and draw a line from the small branches all the way to the trunk. Hit Shift R a few times, which doesn't actually appear to be doing anything. Perhaps I need to be using the subtract brush, and now try the weight gradient. Oh, but first turning on vertex selection masking. Let's try this again. There we go. I need to have an appropriate brush selected. And there we go. Now I've started to decrease the vertex weights across all of these branches. And now I'll go in one by one and fine-tune each branch. Selecting in edit mode, tabbing back to weight paint mode, weight gradient, drawing from the tip of the branch all the way down to the base. Shift R several times until we see the tip start to turn green. And ideally, we'll get it to turn blue. So maybe I can do the weight gradient tool again in a isolated area at the tip. Turn off vertex masking. There we go. That's looking pretty good, but we do want some displacement, so I don't want it all the way blue. About like that. Kind of like a blue-green. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so now that you see how I'm doing that, I'm going to quickly time-lapse through the rest of these branches. Okay, so that's it for the weight painting. We have very nice gradients for each branch. And let's be sure to save our scene because that was a decent amount of work. I don't want to lose that. And change to object mode. And for previewing purposes, let's turn our preview multi-res count to 4 so we see the full resolution. And I'm going to kind of zoom in here on the trunk with our roots and now assign the vertex group that we just created to our displacement modifier. And look in the viewport at how the displacement values change. There we go. That's much better. So it's not quite so intense on the roots and also on the branches. Much more believable, much more realistic. And the other thing I want to try before rendering is to add another level of subdivision to get a little bit more geometry for the displacement to displace, have a little bit more detail in there. Now this is going to take a bit longer to render, but I think it's worth it, especially for close shots. So in the viewport, let's turn the preview for multi-res back down to 2, or maybe even 1. We'll leave it at 2. And then I can collapse that modifier, and let's add a subdivision surface modifier. Change the render levels from 2 to 1, just one extra level of resolution, and put this in between our multi-res and displacement. So now we have 4 times as much geometry for the displacement modifier to do its thing. And I'll go ahead and turn off that additional subsurf in the viewport. There's no reason to bog it down with that, only at render time. And before I render, I'll jump over to my UV image editor, make sure I'm in slot 2 so we can see the before and after, and hit render. Alright, let's take a closer look. And yeah, look at all that glorious detail. Okay, so Alt-J to switch from before and after. Obviously the detail is much finer. Not so blocky and chunky. Also, it's a little bit less poofy because overall I decreased the strength by half. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. And also on the branches themselves, they're not so intensely displaced. It's much more appropriately relative to the size of the branch itself. Cool, I'm pretty satisfied. Now let's start building our shader. Let's jump back to our 3D view and split our window vertically. I'll make the bottom section the node editor for our materials. And let's see, the tree doesn't have a material at the moment. Let's click new and rename this new material tree. Let's go find those nodes with period on our number pad. And first thing to do is plug in the texture that we painted. So input, Shift A, input texture coordinate, then Shift A again, texture, image texture, and plug in our UV texture coordinate into the vector of our image texture. And since the image is already embedded in the .blend file, let's see, zoom in here a little and choose treecolor.png. That color output goes into the color swatch of the diffuse BSDF. And for the shader building, instead of rendering the whole image, I'll just isolate the facial area, about like that. And let's choose a new swatch quickly to slot number 3 and render this. And that looks pretty good with our color map plugged in. Very cool. But I do want a specular component, so we'll add a, let's see, shader glossy BSDF. And if you've watched any of my shading tutorials, you know what's coming next. And that is the Fresnel component. So input, layer weight, Shift A, add a converter, color ramp. And let's go ahead and move these on top of the diffuse node. And to dial this Fresnel value in, you know that I like to use the 3D view. So let's change our viewport shading to rendered. And in the node editor, add a shader emission shader. The facing value of our layer weight goes into the factor of our color ramp, and the color of our color ramp goes into the color swatch of the emission into surface of our material output. Okay, so in the color ramp, I want to use the interpolation, B-spline interpolation type. And let's drag up our darker flag and drag down our lighter flag. About like that. I think that value will be nice. And let's see, go ahead and add a color, color mix RGB after the color ramp, and use the color ramp as the factor in the mix. And then these two color swatches is what we define the mixture of our glossy and diffuse. So Shift A, shader, mix the glossy in with the diffuse, and let's see. Let's go ahead and plug up that mix shader into the surface output. We don't need the emission anymore. and we have a chrome tree. So a value of 0.5 is way too much. Let's dial that down to 0.1. Yeah, I think that's okay. How about a roughness value of 0.3? Yeah, I think that's appropriate. A tree really isn't shiny. It just has a slight reflectivity, especially when we come around the sides because of Fresnel. So in our Mix RGB node, the top swatch is going to be the black value, meaning the surface that faces the camera directly. So let's use that, use a value of, let's say, 0.05 there. And then the second swatch, let's make that a value of 0.2. Okay, plug that into the factor of our mix shader. And yeah, I think that preview is looking pretty nice. So let's do a render now. Change to slot 4. Hit render. Let's see before and after with Alt-J. So that's specular component. Yeah, it brings out some of that detail in the displacement. And yeah, I like how that looks. I do want to tweak it a little bit. Let's come over here to the color ramp, and I'm going to push the white flag to the right, also the black flag to the right as well. And then in the mix node, I want to make it a little bit more reflective on the edges. So we'll change the value to 0.3 instead of 0.2. And also, I want to go ahead and use our displacement texture as the color for our glossy to break it up. Right now it's just a solid sheen all the way across our tree, and I want to break that up, and that displacement map should work fine for that. So let's duplicate our image texture, plug up the UV, and then choose our tree displacement PNG, color into the glossy BSDF color. Change to slot 5 and render that. Let's see before and after. Before, after. Let's get even closer. Yeah, you can see that the cracks get darker because they're not reflecting anything anymore. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Very gnarled, which is what I was going for. Alright, so what's left for the shader? You know, I think I'm going to plug up the displacement map into the displacement output, which means a bump map. Let's just see what that does. I'll cut it down to a value of, let's see, converter, math, change the operation to multiply, and the value to 0.5. We'll cut it in half and render that, see if that does anything for us. Let's take a look at the before and after. Yeah, I actually think that's helping out a little bit. It's just slightly adding more definition and breaking up that specular as well, because the bump map will pick up even finer detail than our displacement map, because it's limited to the amount of subdivisions for our geometry. So keeping this bump at a small value will give us the highest frequency detail possible. Okay, so I want to do a full screen render with the background turned off. So in my render settings, let's turn off or turn on transparent under the film drop down. Head over to the 3D view to hit Shift B, well, Z to get out of viewport rendering, and then Shift B to select our entire frame and hit render. And this is what the whole tree looks like. We can see a lot of high frequency detail and this blue rim light, the Fresnel effect reflecting the sky, which looks pretty cool. And yeah, I really like the way this shader's turning out. In fact, I think I'll call it done, which leaves only one more thing in the creation of this tree asset, and that's going to be the addition of several small twigs and branches growing from these branches that are built into the geometry. Because if I open up that reference image again, where is that at? Here we go. We basically have these branches, which you can't see because it's a black grease pencil. Let's change that to white. So I've built in these branches And now I'm ready for these smaller ones. And so to create that, let's go back to the 3D view. And I want to create a standalone tree limb. So this will serve as kind of a simplified summary of the entire course so far. So I'll make my 3D view a little bit larger, and back to the skin modifier by adding a mesh plane, and then hit the slash key on my number pad to go into local view so I can just concentrate on this geometry. Tab into edit mode, Alt M, merge at the center. Modifier tab, add the skin modifier. Then add 2 subdivision surface modifiers. Put one above the skin modifier and then one below. Here we go. Jump into the front view and start extruding out a branch-like shape. Something like that. Maybe add one more to the end up here. And now turning on proportional editing, which it's already on, go to the smooth editing fall off and Alt S, or I mean Control A. And let's mouse wheel down to increase the fall off. There we go. Making the base of the limb a little bit thicker. And then Control A from the top. And now let's get out of the orthographic view and start extruding some limbs. And let's set our view camera at an off angle, so when we start extruding these out, our branch is offset. Control A at the tip to scale that down. There we go, just like that. Maybe add a couple more points to the end of the branch. Let's add another one. Maybe rotate this around. There we go. That's a decent branch. So let's see. The last thing I want to do is make sure that the base of the branch extends beyond the origin of the object, which is right here at the center of the world. So let's extrude one more point down and give it a little bit of a bulbous end to it. There we go. That should work good. Now Alt-C to convert to a mesh and get rid of our modifiers. And then tab into edit mode to cut our UV seams. The same idea where I'm trying to isolate tubular structures. Control E to mark this seam. And let's isolate this entire structure. Once I've done that, I want to cut a seam lengthwise to make sure that this tube unwraps flat. And repeat that process for all of our tubes. And once we have all of our seams cut, we'll split the window, change this left one to the UV image editor, and let's go grab our tree color. Because I don't need to paint a new texture. These are going to be small twigs and branches that aren't the main focus, so I can go ahead and reuse the textures for the rest of the tree. So select all of my mesh elements, hit U in the viewport, unwrap. Now let's maximize the UV image editor, get rid of that grease pencil mark. And first I'll scale it down to be significantly smaller than our other branches. So about like that, just to kind of ballpark the scale relative in the scene. Perhaps a little bit bigger than that. And now I can just start placing these wherever there's consistent bark texture. Now it's possible I made these a little bit too small, so I'm going to go one by one and hit S, 1.5 on all my islands to scale them up a little bit. There we go. Make sure all my islands are appropriately placed, which they are. So we can get rid of the 3D view and let's see, smooth out my mesh of the faces to make them smooth shading. So in my tool panel, under shading, hit smooth. And let's add the appropriate modifiers to match the rest of the tree. So that needs to be a subdivision surface. Let's make the render count 3 and the view count 3. Then add another modifier, the displace modifier. And the texture, we can pick our tree displacement. And the texture coordinates, we can make that UV. And the strength, let's go to 0.05. We want it to be significantly less intense than the rest of the tree. And yeah, I think 0.05 looks pretty good. Of course, that is dependent on the actual scale of the object. Now, some of these branches, it looks like I forgot to scale the tips down, so I can quickly jump to sculpt mode. And let's see, turn off my subdivision surface and displace and simply smooth the tips. There we go. And that's going to be it for the twig creation. Let's name the object twig.000 because I will be duplicating these several times and I want them to number themselves properly. So now that we're done with the twig, hit / again on the number pad. And I'm ready to start duplicating these around our tree branches. And to do this, I want to turn on face snapping in object mode, which gives me an option called align rotation with the snapping target. And I want to enable that and then also change this closest option to be active. And now if I hit G in the viewport and hold Control, we can see that our branch snaps to our tree and aligns to the normal of the object that we're snapping to. So that makes it very easy to place our tree branch. And we can scale it down to be more appropriate. Maybe tab into edit mode and modify this. It's a little bit too straight from that particular angle. We need to make our influence significantly smaller. So let's just move that around. Maybe move this whole thing by rotating it like that. And also keep in mind that as we snap, what's actually snapping to the surface is the origin of our object. And that's why I wanted our geometry to extend a little bit further down than the origin, because that way the tree branch sticks into this other tree branch very naturally. And we don't see the seam. We certainly won't see it once we render. Okay, and if I change the transform orientation to local, if I hit RZZ, it'll rotate around the local Z axis. And that allows me to pick a better orientation if I want to. So let's duplicate this again with Shift D. And then once I'm done moving, I want to look in the operator options over here on the left below the tool panel and turn on linked. This means that both objects use the same object data. They're individual objects, but the object data is the same. And we can see this over here in the object data panel that plane.002 has 2 users. And this way, if I want to tweak something, let's say I move that branch out like that, tab into object mode, and we can see that the other one has updated to match it exactly. This is because they're using the same object data. So back to the duplicate. Let's hit G and snap it to align with our tree branch. Scale it down. Rotate it in its local Z axis. About like that. And let's see, maybe the entire twig is a little bit too skinny. Maybe. Let's try Alt S with everything selected. Make it a little bit thicker. Yeah, I think I like that. Very nice. And now I can just continue duplicating this around the tree branches by placing them mainly at the knots. That's typically where we see branches fork into other branches. So I'll keep that in mind as I duplicate. And you might be thinking, why doesn't he use a particle hair system? Because I can very easily populate this entire branch, or as much of the branch as I want to, with a vertex group, and then have the ability to comb the particles in whatever direction I choose. And if you're thinking that, that's actually what I wanted to do originally. So you certainly could do it that way, but it was a little bit slower for me, surprisingly. So once you get in the habit of duplicating, snapping, and rotating, this actually ends up being a little bit faster, or at least for me it did. So anyway, I will speed up the process now as I populate the rest of the branches. There we go. I think that's populated enough. It's looking a little bit more believable now. And let's see, I think that I actually lost the linked object data thing that I was trying to do. Yeah, so this branch is not sharing its object data. So I need to fix this by selecting all of my branches and then deselecting everything that's not a branch. So going into wireframe can make that a little more obvious. And then select one of the original branches that I duplicated that is sharing its object data and hit Control-L, Link Object Data. Now all 13 branches are using the same object data. And again, this is nice if I want to make some changes. Making a tweak here in edit mode, tabbing out, and all the branches update. So yeah, that's good and ready to be rendered. Although they do need the same material. So let me Control-Z to get my selection back. Shift-click our tree trunk, Control-L, link materials. And now if I jump into rendered viewport preview, I seem to have lost the world image. Oh, because I changed its name. So let's go find that. There we go, that's better. And we can see that our tree limbs, our little twigs, match pretty well with the rest of our tree. And they certainly add that finishing touch to make this tree a little bit more believable. And we are ready for kind of a final render of sorts. I do want to tweak my sun a little bit. Let's change the strength to 3. And I'm getting way too much bounce light from the ground plane, which does not have a shader. So add a new shader and take its value, its color value down quite a bit. And then let's try rotating our sun around just to get a little bit more shadow play across the model. I can't really see our sun anymore. Oh, I know what I did. In the world settings, I made the world environment map a strength of 3 instead of 1. So let's turn that back down. Yeah, go to the sun and let's change that strength to 3 and rotate that around. Yeah, about like that. Then I can parent the sun to our cam and lights empty. That way if I want to render from any other camera angle, hit 0 to look into the camera's view. And now rotate the cam and lights empty. And the lighting follows with it and is relative to the camera. So I usually set that up, and you've probably seen me set that up anytime I want to test a shader. But anyway, let's do a final render. And this is our finished spooky tree. We can see that the twigs blend very nicely into all of our other branches. and it feels complete. Now you can drop this asset into a haunted forest to create a complete Halloween type scene, or whatever you want. That's going to be it for this course. I hope you learned something about building custom trees in Blender. I also hope you can see how these techniques are useful elsewhere. Thank you for watching.